Research shows systemic health and societal inequalities are making the pandemic particularly brutal for communities of color, and that may be making more Black families actually reluctant to send their children back to school for in-class learning. So Kate Smith joins us now to discuss the reasons why more minority families are opting into remote learning. This is a really interesting topic, Kate. You wrote an article titled "Wary of the System, Black Families Opt for Remote Learning." And you spoke to a number of people for this article, including Clarice Doctor. She's a single mom from New Jersey. And she said that time and time again that she's seen the system fail us, meaning her and her children. And how can she trust the system? So I'm wondering if, you know, when we were going to talk about this topic, I didn't know whether it was because the system as it was before wasn't working anyways for minority parents and children. So here's an opportunity to try something a little bit different. And is that at the core of, you know, a lot of the conversations you've had?
So, Anne-Marie, that's exactly what's been at the core of so many of the conversations that I've been able to have with parents and particularly mothers of color. And, you know, just like every other family in the country, over the summer, they grappled with the idea of, should I send my child to in-person learning or to remote learning? It's a difficult question. There's so many questions about the coronavirus. But when I was speaking to all of these families of color, what I found was that the overwhelming majority of those parents were not comfortable sending their children back to in-person learning. And there was all sorts of different reasons. It was, you know, the prevalence of multi-generational households. You know, their jobs really didn't work out for it. But the one common thread that I kept hearing was that this isn't a COVID-19 problem. This is a problem that has stemmed long before the pandemic. And it's that we live in a society and we live in a system that simply has not served families of color well. We have, you know, discrepancies in healthcare outcomes because of this. We have gaps in education because of this. You know, the list goes on, and we've spent so much of this summer looking into these things and talking about them. But on the ground and what people are saying and the decisions that they're making, they're saying that, you know, we've done a lot of work this summer. We think things are going in the right direction, but simply as it stands right now, I do not trust the system with what they said was their most precious thing, which is, you know, their child.
Mm-hmm.
In Oxford, Mississippi, one school district had 54% of Black students choose remote learning to start the school year compared to less than 20% of students. Explain why that is.
So this is a really interesting example, Vlad, and the reason is because we actually have very little data on how Black families have chosen their in-person or remote learning this fall. That's because very few school districts bothered to ask the race of families when they were making these decisions about remote or in-person learning. And Oxford is one of the very few school districts that has, you know, concrete data about whether, you know, what parents are choosing and what race those families are. And what they found, I was talking to the superintendent there, what they found was that overwhelmingly, like you mentioned, white families were comfortable sending their children back. Black families were not, and the superintendent pointed to a few different things. Again, that multi-generational household keeps coming up, the idea that a lot of times grandparents are living in the same house, they are at high risk for COVID-19, it's not worth the exposure. The other problem that they had was gaps in healthcare systems. You know, healthcare insurance, a lot of these families are underinsured, they're uninsured, and what this system was doing, which I thought was particularly interesting, was that to try to even this out and try to make it better, they were actually implementing coronavirus testing sites within all of the schools that were available to anyone, students, teachers, even parents of those students, whether or not you are participating in remote or in-person learning. And so, you know, what I'm saying here is that this is one of the few examples that we have of how different races are approaching in-person and remote learning. And these are kind of the things that these districts are looking to do to try to remedy this and make this right so that we're not placing a disproportionate burden on these families of color to do remote learning this fall.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting story. Just in my own sort of circle, I can think of two families who have chosen to either to homeschool or do some sort of like combination of remote learning with the school, but also their own thing with sort of those pods that have been developed. And the primary reason was not because of COVID-19. It was because they didn't like the system and they were unhappy with the outcomes thus far, and this was the excuse that they needed to try something different. So you spoke to families from different parts of the country, and I think that's important too, because the families that I am talking about, they are working remotely, they have an extended support system, so they can kind of almost like create schools for their children. They're middle-class families, they have a lot of options. How does geography play a factor in how individuals that you spoke to look at remote learning?
Well, Anne Marie, that is one of the most interesting things that I found in my reporting, was that it actually was very similar between geography, between, the level of privilege that these families had, and all sorts of different resources. It transcends all of these different identifying features that we normally, will parse people out into, right? It didn't really matter that, I spoke to one woman, she works in a grocery store. She can't do that from home. It didn't matter though. She was not sending her child back to in-person learning, even though that would make her life, as she told me, much easier, but it didn't matter. And I spoke to another woman. She's a stay-at-home mom. She comes from quite a lot of privilege, and she sends her children to a private school. And again, it didn't matter, even though she was sending her child to a very expensive, wonderful private school, she still didn't trust the system. She told me about a time when she expressed a concern that her student was bored. And the idea was that these administrators didn't come back to her saying, oh, well, let's figure out why that is. The answer was, I don't know about that. Let's figure this out. And to her, that was the signal that, you know what, this school doesn't serve Black parents the same way that they serve white parents. And whether they're doing it, on purpose or not, the fact is that it is happening, and it is their most precious commodity, their children, who are the ones that are kind of, caught in the middle of all of this.
So, in fact, this hybrid learning or remote learning is perhaps not getting the same attention and resources from school districts as in-person learning.
That's exactly right, Vlad. And I think that's what makes kind of this story so important, is that as we're talking about, certain families choosing in-person learning versus remote learning, the fact is that if remote learning isn't as successful in their academic outcomes as in-person learning is, what we're finding is that you're going to see Black families disproportionately, bearing the burden of that problem. There was a McKinsey study released earlier this summer that showed that there could be an achievement gap. Now, that's the way people measure the educational achievement between different races, genders, all of those different ways that we measure things. And that report showed that if, in fact, these families are deciding to keep their children at home, even with good in-person learning, that achievement gap could increase 15 to 20%. So these are real educational outcomes that we're talking about here. And the idea is that a lot of these school districts, they're not permanently going remote. It's something we're doing in the interim when we get back to in-person learning. So you're not seeing the same investment for making remote learning work as you are to try to get people back into the schools and make that safe. You're seeing a lot more investment on this side, but not so much on the remote learning side.
Boy, Kate, you are speaking my dilemma with my own daughter, so I'm really glad you looked into this. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, excellent reporting as always, Kate. You do an incredible job, and I love how you find these sort of underreported stories, or perhaps they are headlines, or they're what we call readers in the broadcast journalism business, but you do these really deep dives into them to explain what's actually going on behind the headline, and so that is much appreciated here at CBSN.
Thank you, Vaughn. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and you can find Kate's reporting on why families of color are opting into remote learning on CBSNews.com.